The moment the base security vehicles pulled up to my driveway and the two MPs stepped out, I knew exactly what was about to happen. Karen Whitmore had no idea she just made the worst call of her life. She was standing there in her orange blazer, pointing at my Lamborghini like it was evidence of a crime. She was completely confident that these officers were here to remove me from my own property. I just stood there with my coffee and watched her face as the lead MP walked straight past her, came to attention, and saluted me. What she didn't know in that moment was that I didn't just work on the base. I was the officer who commanded the entire security division she just called for help. By the time that conversation was over, her reign as HOA President was about to unravel in ways she never saw coming. Before we jump into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you've ever had a crazy HOA moment, hit subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. White heavy checkmark adjusted version, balanced full stops. I need to back up just enough for this to make sense, but not far. What happened that morning didn't come out of nowhere. Karen Whitmore had been circling for weeks. I'm Colonel Marcus Hayes, and I'd been living in that off-base neighborhood just outside the installation for about 8 months when this all started. Quiet street, decent neighbors, the kind of place where people minded their own business and you could actually relax after a long day managing security operations for an entire Air Force base. I bought the house because it was private, had a solid 2-car garage, and the HOA seemed inactive enough that I didn't think it would be an issue. That changed the week I brought the Lamborghini home. It wasn't new and it wasn't a flex, just something I'd wanted for years and finally pulled the trigger on after a deployment bonus cleared. But the morning I parked it in my own driveway for the first time, I saw the curtain move in the house across the street. Karen lived there with her husband Greg, who I'd maybe spoken to twice. Within 48 hours I had my first HOA violation notice taped to my front door. The letter claimed my vehicle was in violation of Section 7.4 of the Community Guidelines due to excessive visibility of recreational or luxury vehicles, and requested that I park it in the garage or relocate it to approved storage. I read it twice because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I checked the actual HOA bylaws that night and found nothing even close to that language, so I ignored it. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. 3 days later, another notice appeared. This time claiming my driveway was being used for unapproved commercial storage, and that the Lamborghini constituted a business asset that violated residential zoning. I didn't run a business and the car was registered to me personally, so again, I disregarded it. I made a mental note to show up to the next HOA meeting whenever that was. What I didn't know then was that Karen had been doing this to other people in the neighborhood for months, targeting anyone she felt didn't belong or didn't show her enough respect. I'd just become her newest project. The third notice came with a fine attached. $250 for failure to comply with prior warnings, and a threat of legal action if the vehicle wasn't moved within 72 hours. That one I didn't ignore because now she was trying to take my money over a rule that didn't exist. I sent a calm, professional email to the HOA board email address listed on the letterhead. I explained that I'd reviewed the bylaws and found no such restriction and requested a formal hearing to dispute the fines. I didn't get a response from the board, but I did get a response from Karen. It came in the form of her husband's SUV parked horizontally across the end of my driveway the next morning, completely blocking me in. I walked outside in my civilian clothes, still holding my coffee, and found her standing next to the vehicle with her arms crossed and that orange blazer on like she was about to conduct a board meeting. She informed me that until I removed the Lamborghini and paid the outstanding fines, my driveway access was suspended per emergency HOA enforcement powers. When I told her she needed to move her vehicle immediately or I'd have it towed, she smiled and pulled out her phone. That's when she called base security and reported that a civilian was illegally parked on restricted HOA property and refusing to comply with lawful orders. I realized she had no idea who I actually was. I stayed calm because that's what 20 years in the Air Force teaches you. But watching her dial that number while standing in front of my own driveway was one of the most surreal moments of my career. I knew the next 10 minutes were going to be very uncomfortable for her. She had no idea that the security division she was calling reported directly to me. She didn't know that I'd personally approved the duty roster for that shift, or that the two MPs who were about to respond had sat in my office for performance reviews less than a month ago. All she knew was that she'd found what she thought was the ultimate power move and she was about to deploy it. The response time was fast because the base was only 12 minutes away. While we waited, she made sure to tell me exactly how much trouble I was in for parking illegally on HOA property, refusing to comply with official notices, and now obstructing her authority as president. I didn't argue because I didn't need to. I just sipped my coffee and waited for the sound of the engines coming up the street. When those two patrol vehicles finally rolled up with lights on, I saw her straighten her blazer and put on what I can only describe as her courtroom face. She was ready to win. The lead MP was Staff Sergeant Chen, someone I'd worked with on 3 separate security incidents over the past year. The moment he stepped out of the vehicle and saw me standing there in civilian clothes, I watched his eyes widen just slightly before he caught himself. He didn't salute immediately because that would have given it away too fast. But he walked directly toward me instead of toward Karen. I could see the confusion starting to creep into her expression as he stopped 2 feet in front of me and said, "Good morning, sir," in a tone that was just professional enough to sound neutral but just familiar enough to signal recognition. Karen tried to cut in immediately. She started talking about how I was the one who needed to be removed, how I'd been harassing her and violating community rules. But Chen didn't even look at her and instead asked me if everything was all right. I told him everything was fine, that there'd been a misunderstanding about my driveway, and that Mrs. Whitmore had called because she believed I was parked illegally. That's when he finally turned to her and asked her to explain the situation. What happened next is something I'll never forget because I watched her entire demeanor shift from confidence to confusion in the span of about 15 seconds. She explained that I was a civilian resident who'd been cited multiple times for vehicle violations, that I'd refused to comply, and that I was now trespassing on HOA-controlled property. But the moment she said, "civilian resident," Chen's expression changed and he glanced back at me with what I can only describe as barely concealed disbelief. He asked her if she knew who I was, and she said of course she did. I was Marcus Hayes, the resident at this address. Chen nodded slowly and asked her if she was aware that Colonel Hayes was the installation's director of security and the officer in charge of the entire division she'd just called for assistance. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the color drain from her face as she processed what she'd just heard. She looked from Chen to me and back again like she was waiting for someone to tell her it was a joke. But Chen's expression didn't change and neither did mine. She started to stammer something about not knowing, about this being a civilian neighborhood matter. But Chen politely informed her that calling base security to report false information about a senior officer was a serious issue and that he'd need to file a report about the incident. That should have been enough to end it, but Karen Whitmore was not someone who accepted losing gracefully. She pivoted immediately. She claimed that my rank didn't exempt me from HOA rules, that I'd still violated the community guidelines and owed fines, and that if base security wouldn't enforce the parking issue then she'd pursue it through the county and the courts. Chen told her that was her right but that she needed to move her vehicle from my driveway immediately. After a long tense moment where I genuinely thought she might refuse, she finally got in the SUV and backed it out onto the street. The MPs left shortly after and I thought that would be the wake-up call she needed to back off. I was wrong. 2 days later I received a formal letter from a lawyer representing the HOA. It claimed that I owed over $1,500 in accumulated fines and that failure to pay within 10 days would result in a lien being placed on my property. The letter cited multiple violations I'd never been properly notified about. It included charges for things like lawn maintenance delays and unapproved exterior modifications that had never happened. It was signed by Karen Whitmore as HOA President with the board's full support. That's when I realized this wasn't just about the car anymore. She was willing to fabricate whatever she needed to make this stick. I started asking around the neighborhood quietly. I talked to a few of the other military families who lived on the street. What I found out made everything click into place in the worst possible way. Karen had been doing this for over 2 years and I wasn't even close to being her first target. I was just the first one who had the resources and the position to actually fight back. 3 other military families had been harassed out of the neighborhood in the past 18 months. All of them junior enlisted or mid-grade NCOs who didn't have the time or the money to challenge her in court. She'd used the same playbook every time: fabricated violations, escalating fines, threatening letters, and legal pressure until they either paid up or sold their homes and left. One family had been fined over $4,000 for repeated lawn violations during a deployment when the service member wasn't even in the country. When they couldn't pay, Karen had pursued a lien on their property until they were forced to sell at a loss just to get out from under it. I sat in my home office that night reading through copies of violation notices that neighbors had kept, comparing them to the actual HOA bylaws. The pattern was impossible to ignore because none of the cited violations existed in the governing documents. She'd been inventing rules, enforcing them selectively, and using her position as HOA president to target anyone she wanted removed from the community. The worst part was that the rest of the board had either been too intimidated to stop her or too indifferent to care. I had everything I needed to prove fraud, harassment, and abuse of authority. But I also knew that going after her directly would turn this into a public spectacle that could reflect poorly on the base and my position. That's when I made the call I should have made from the beginning and contacted the Staff Judge Advocate Office on base to report the situation formally. Military members are protected under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Using fraudulent HOA enforcement to extract money from military families during deployments or duty assignments is exactly the kind of predatory behavior the law was designed to prevent. Within 48 hours, I had a legal team reviewing everything I'd gathered. What I didn't expect was how fast things would move once the base got involved. This wasn't just about me anymore. The moment they saw the pattern of targeting military families, it became a legal issue that extended beyond one neighborhood dispute. The base opened an investigation, contacted the other affected families, and within a week had built a case that showed systematic harassment and financial fraud targeting service members. They sent a formal letter to the HOA board, copied to Karen personally, informing them that the fines levied against me and 3 other families were fraudulent, that legal action was being considered, and that all outstanding balances were to be voided immediately. I thought that would be enough to end it. I thought she'd realize she was cornered and back down quietly. But Karen Whitmore had spent 2 years believing she was untouchable, and she wasn't about to let a letter from some military lawyers change that. She doubled down. She sent a response through her lawyer claiming that the HOA was an independent civilian organization not subject to military oversight, that all fines were legitimate and enforceable, and that any attempt to interfere with HOA governance would be met with legal action against the base itself. It was the most catastrophically stupid move she could have made. What she'd just done was challenge the legal authority of a federal installation to protect its service members from fraud. The base legal team responded by filing a formal complaint with the county, referring the case to the state attorney general's office, and notating her actions in an official report that would be attached to every security clearance background check for anyone associated with her. But the real turning point came when the base investigators started interviewing neighbors and discovered that Karen had been forging board signatures on violation notices for over a year. This meant that most of the enforcement actions she'd taken hadn't even been approved by the HOA board and were being done entirely under her own authority. 2 of the board members resigned the moment they found out, claiming they had no idea the notices were being sent in their names. The 3rd demanded an emergency meeting to remove her as president immediately. The neighborhood meeting happened on a Tuesday night, and I didn't attend because I didn't need to. But 3 of my neighbors who were there told me later that it was one of the most brutal public confrontations they'd ever witnessed. Karen tried to defend her actions. She claimed she was protecting property values and enforcing standards. But when the forged signatures came up and when the targeted harassment of military families was raised, the room turned on her completely. Parents who'd been fined, neighbors who'd watched families forced out, and even people who'd stayed quiet for years all spoke up. By the end of the meeting, she'd been voted out as president, removed from the board entirely, and formally notified that the HOA would not be defending her in any legal actions that resulted from her conduct. She left that meeting in tears, humiliated in front of the entire community. I heard later that she and her husband put their house on the market less than a week after. But that still wasn't the end of it, because the state attorney general's office doesn't let fraud cases just disappear quietly. The investigation took 4 months to fully conclude. By the time it was over, Karen Whitmore wasn't just removed from the HOA board. She was facing actual legal consequences that would follow her for years. The state attorney general's office filed civil charges for fraud and forgery based on the falsified board signatures and the systematic targeting of military families. While she avoided criminal prosecution through a settlement agreement, the terms were brutal enough that it might as well have been a conviction. She was ordered to pay full restitution to every family she'd targeted, which totaled just over $18,000, plus legal fees and administrative penalties that brought the final amount closer to $30,000. She was permanently barred from serving in any HOA leadership role in the state. The base legal team also ensured that her actions were documented in a formal report that would appear in background checks for anyone living with her. This effectively meant that her husband Greg, who worked as a contractor with a security clearance, had to disclose the entire incident during his next reinvestigation. It cost him a contract renewal that he'd been counting on. They sold the house within 2 months and moved out of state. The last I heard, they'd relocated to somewhere in the Midwest where nobody knew the story and they could start over. But the internet being what it is, the details of the case had already been picked up by a local news outlet and shared widely enough that her name was permanently attached to the phrase HOA fraud. For the rest of the neighborhood, the fallout was quieter but just as significant. The entire board was restructured. The bylaws were formally reviewed and rewritten to prevent selective enforcement. The new leadership made it a priority to reach out to the military families who'd been driven out and apologize on behalf of the community. One family actually moved back after the changes were made and the fines were voided. Seeing their kids playing in the front yard again felt like a small victory in a situation that had caused so much unnecessary pain. The Lamborghini stayed in my driveway and nobody ever said another word about it. Over time it became something of a neighborhood landmark because people knew the story and it represented something bigger than just a car. It was a reminder that power without accountability leads to abuse, that silence enables harm, and that sometimes the people being targeted are the ones with the ability to fight back if they're just given the chance. I stayed in that house for another 3 years before transferring to a new assignment. In that time, the neighborhood became exactly what it should have been from the start, a quiet, peaceful place where people looked out for each other instead of looking for reasons to tear each other down. The new HOA president was a retired teacher who actually read the bylaws before making decisions. The board meetings became so uneventful that attendance dropped to almost nothing because there was simply nothing to fight about anymore. But what stuck with me long after I left wasn't the victory or the vindication. It was the realization of how many people had suffered in silence before I ever arrived and how close I'd come to being just another name on a list of families bullied out of their own homes by someone who'd been given just enough authority to be dangerous. If I hadn't been in the position I was in, if I hadn't had access to base legal resources and the protection of federal law, I would have been facing the same impossible choice that those other families faced: pay fines for violations that didn't exist, spend thousands on lawyers to fight a battle that might take years, or just walk away and let her win. The military teaches you a lot of things, but one of the most important lessons is that leadership without integrity is just tyranny with a title. Karen Whitmore had turned a neighborhood HOA into her own personal fiefdom because nobody had ever held her accountable. She'd counted on people being too tired, too busy, or too intimidated to fight back. For a long time that strategy had worked. But the moment she targeted someone who had the resources and the resolve to push back, the entire structure she'd built collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. I think about that sometimes when I hear stories about HOA disputes. Stories about neighbors being fined into bankruptcy over mailbox colors or grass height. About families losing their homes because someone on a board decided they didn't belong. I wonder how many of those situations could be stopped if people just knew their rights and refused to be intimidated. Power only works when people believe it's legitimate. The moment you start asking questions, demanding documentation, and holding people accountable, that power starts to crumble. Karen called base security on me thinking she'd found the ultimate leverage. But what she actually did was expose herself to the one person in the neighborhood who had the authority and the obligation to investigate what she'd been doing. That single phone call unraveled 2 years of unchecked abuse in a matter of weeks. If someone with a title and a clipboard is threatening your home, your money, or your peace of mind, ask yourself one question. Are they enforcing rules, or are they just enforcing their ego? And if you don't know the answer, it might be time to find out before someone else pays the price.